of hosting abilities now. Let's see here.
Quick.
Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. People keep popping up in there. So, okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Political Science Department Capstone presentations. My name's Dr. Michael Artheim, and I'm the chair of the Political Science Department at PLU, and am this semester serving as the Capstone instructor for the department. Let me begin by just thanking each and every student presenting tonight. The work that they've done this semester is really impressive. I've often said that the source of my optimism is the students who are part of our program, and that's never been more true than this year, as students have navigated unprecedented challenges that other students have not experienced before, academic and personal challenges. Throughout all of it, they've maintained a real sense of enthusiasm for learning and a commitment to excellence in their work, which you're going to see here tonight. So you're also going to see PLU's mission of care come through in all of their projects: care for people, for their communities, and for the earth. And I think that is a real testament both to what the students are doing here, as well as the values that PLU espouses. So with that said, I want to walk through some logistical information. So tonight, each project is allotted 15 minutes. So about 10 minutes for the presentation, and then about 5 minutes for questions. And I'll ask you to submit your questions to me through the chat function, and I'll ask the questions to the students for the sake of time. So please, throughout the presentations, be thinking of what you would like to ask them. During the presentations, please make sure to keep your microphone on mute so as not to disturb the presenters. And we have enabled closed captioning for the event at the bottom, if that is helpful for you. So next to the share a screen button, you should find a little box that says CC, and you should be able to click that and select the option for live transcription, and that should that should provide that for you at the very bottom of the screen. If you miss any of the presentations that you wanted to see tonight, then a video of this event will be posted on the Department of Political Science website. And if you would like a YouTube link sent to you specifically, feel free to send me an email. With that said, I am going to go ahead and turn things over to our first presenters, Gracie and Jeremy. And I'm also going to share through the chat I'll share the order of presentations so you can see who is presenting and when, if that would be helpful to you. We're going to stay as close to on schedule as possible. To, some folks are dropping in for certain presentations, so we want to make sure that we start when we're expected to start for different presentations. So I'll go ahead and turn things over for our first presentation. Gracie and Jeremy, whenever you're ready.
Hey, thank you. I'll let Jeremy get a chance to put our slides up. But thanks for letting us kick this off. No pressure at all. We're really excited. We're not stressed. And I think we're ready.
With a few of our interviewees on the call right now.
Yeah, we have esteemed guests in the audience, it seems.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. We'll just get started. Cool. So I'm Gracie, that's Jeremy, and our presentation and paper is entitled, "Is it in to be out? How Washington's queer identified candidates are perceived through identity and binaries." I just want to talk you through very quickly what we're going to share with you today. We're going to start with our research question, some information about our interviews and our methods process. Then we're going to get Jeremy's analysis, then my analysis, and then some of our shared conclusions. We structured it this way because we found as we were working on this process that we were coming away with different conclusions based on our different perspectives. So in order to really live up to our queerness, to live up to the diversity of thought within queerness, we wanted to separate our analysis. And even more than that, if there's one thing that political scientists agree on, it's that they don't agree on anything. So we wanted to separate our two sections out.
Yeah, and so starting with our research question here, after a lot of back and forth, we landed on how do socially constructed binaries like gender, sexuality, and this concept of outness, and the intersection of sexual, racial, and gender identities affect queer identified candidates in electoral politics. To answer this question, we interviewed 9 amazing candidates. Some of them are here with us, but this is the full list. To kind of give a broad overview, not comprehensive, but a pretty broad one, we ended up having 2 candidates from the 43rd Legislative District, which has been historically a gay represented district. We had 1 Republican, 1 trans candidate, 4 women, 2 of them were women of color, and 3 candidates from the east side of the state or the more conservative side of Washington. The interviews were about 20 minutes. They varied a little bit depending on the time constraints, and they addressed our research question in one way or another. So as Gracie said, we have a different analysis. So starting off with mine here, after the interviews, I kind of found 3 main points. First off is that representation matters. From Senator Anderson's appointment in 1987 and then his later electoral win, this opened the door for many queer people to get elected, especially in the 43rd Legislative District. This is evident through our interviews with both candidates from that district, where they both said that being queer was a prerequisite to running and winning that district. Having queer folks in office has also changed the conversations and votes. We heard from many people about the connections they made just by being in the legislature and how that caused key shifts on policies such as equal marriage and anti-discrimination laws. It also affects policy in making it more inclusive. This year, Queer Voices ensured that the menstrual equity bill that passed the legislature would be inclusive of making sure there were products in men's bathrooms as well as women, so not to leave out trans folks. As political power has shifted to younger generations, it's become easier for a candidate to be more openly queer and not face backlash that they traditionally would have. The interviews with Senator Peterson and Senator Leas, who are 2 of the longest serving gay members in the legislature, really showed this clearly about how the dynamics around a queer candidate's outness has changed as representation increases. This doesn't inherently transfer to trans candidates, but we'll get to that a little later in the presentation. Now, the second key point was that in the literature, there's a lot that says that a candidate's identity is going to count against them. People are going to vote against them, they're going to get attacked, and it's going to be a key issue on campaigns when they run. Our interviews didn't really find that. There were assumptions that a candidate's identity would inherently hurt them. One person told one of our interviewees that their identity was too much for their district. But in all, 5 of our candidates said that their identity just wasn't an issue and didn't really come up on the campaign. And instead, they focused on policy issues and what policy issues affected the district. 2 of the candidates that I mentioned before said they did center their identity, but it was because it was a prerequisite to winning and running in that district. And one candidate said that he did experience attacks because of his identity, but those attacks he felt would have been focused on other things. So this wasn't a unique harm to him for being queer. And finally, what I find is that assumptions are made about someone's queer identity and what that means on their policy stances. One candidate told us how certain groups think that they will champion certain issues purely because of their identity, not looking at their district, not messaging, nothing else. Another said that he would use this assumption to his advantage, making sure to include his gay identity in all campaign literature, specifically saying, quote, if people know that I'm LGBT, then they know that I'm probably pro-choice, that I'm definitely pro-LGBT equality, and that I'm probably progressive. This is especially important because we in our interviews, we ended up interviewing a specific candidate who is gay and anti-pro-choice, or anti-choice, pro-life. So we find that these assumptions just aren't accurate and that queer people just aren't a monolith here.
As I listened to our interviewees share their experiences as queer identified candidates and electeds, I thought of a few major themes as well, connected to how they present themselves and their identities. The ones that stood out to me are as follows. 1, though representation matters in a literal sense, appearances matter more, especially in the realm of politics. 2, certain queer identified people are viewed as more acceptable or respectable depending on their other identities, like party affiliation, gender presentation and identity, race, and their profession. And 3, queerness is not a monolith, and recognizing and embracing this complexity is not just important to politics in terms of democracy and justice, but is necessary for representing the full spectrum of queer identities and non-queer ones too. I think it's helpful to think about toolkits and how someone who lives at the intersection of many marginalized identities is likely to have a more developed toolkit for understanding oppression, even when it doesn't apply directly to them, and what works to dismantle it, simply having had more practice and lived experience. Someone who lives at the intersection of many privileged identities is likely to struggle more with empathy for oppression and with perceiving the interrelatedness of social issues. Those tools inform policy once the candidates are elected. One candidate described it as having different lenses. The white candidates will have a lens of whiteness, and the woman candidates will have a lens connected to womanhood, etc. The more developed the toolkit, the more likely the candidate is to recognize how others are experiencing oppression and advocate for policies that would impact larger groups of marginalized people. Here we have like Black Lives Matter, economic justice, and trans liberation. This toolkit can be refined through practice for those that may not share a series of marginalized identities, but it is not inherent for those who have consistently brushed up against systemic oppression. How acceptable or respectable a queer candidate is perceived as being is ultimately grounded in how successfully they perform their gender role and how much of a threat their identity and behavioral practices represent to the established order. To run for office means to be put under a microscope, so it's hard to deviate from the norm. You need to be electable, and sometimes that means not looking queer or talking about ideas that are too radical. It's really tempting to compartmentalize and view queerness in binaries, but in order to achieve social justice and a truly representative democracy, we must recognize that queerness is not monolithic. In examining our own complexities, we can find commonalities with others, demonstrating the ways in which the intersection of multiple marginalized identities enhances the aforementioned toolkits for dismantling systems of power and complicating simplistic ways of understanding people. This is important because it helps to explain how queer candidates can invite further complexity into our democracy and help vary our representations of queer individuals across the gender and sexuality spectrums.
Now, in our conclusions, we had many agreements, but starting with this question, one place where we vary is when we look at, is electing a queer identified person progress in and of itself? This was inspired by one candidate saying that non-threatening white male gays broke an initial barrier for all queer people. I argue that it is inherently progress for a queer identified person to be elected. Historically, in the 43rd, once Senator Anderson was elected, it led to more queer folks in the district. As the LGBTQ caucus has grown, even more candidates have been able to win while being out and centering their identities. In 2018 alone, 3 new out queer identified candidates, 2 of them not white men, were elected to the legislature. Representation represents progress.
My reflection led to a different conclusion. Based on our interviews, it seemed as though a queer identity was not an inherent guarantee that a legislator would vote a certain way or do a certain thing. This is because we understand intersectionality to be the ways that intersecting identities create unique experiences. For example, a queer woman of color is impacted by her queerness much differently than a queer white man could be. So when that man knocks down a barrier, it's not the same one that the queer woman of color is up against. It's not a given when a queer person is elected that they will represent all of the queer experience, because that simply is not possible. Progress is not electing an individual to office. Progress is what they do once they're in there. And queer people's varied experiences lead to varied visions of what progress looks like.
Now, in our final conclusions, where we agree on two main points, starting with the first one. Political science must expand its research. Common methods require that a large group of queer identified candidates are elected for us to average out their experiences and understand commonalities that exist. By conducting interviews, we were able to discover the experiences without relying on the sample size, and what we discovered conflicted with much of the literature on this subject. The field is rapidly changing, especially with shifts in public acceptance. To not include personal experiences of queer identified individuals only hurts political science's ability to understand what is happening in practice and inherently enforces the barriers that currently exist.
We asked the candidates essentially what's next for LGBTQ plus people in our state. Most included trans representation, access to healthcare, and legal protections. Several included the importance of responding to police brutality and racism. There were mentions of funding for good schools and childcare and elder care and housing justice. This only solidifies the importance of complex queer representations, since these candidates defined LGBTQ issues as encompassing more than just queer identified people, expanding them to include problems that affect non-queer identified members of our state. If you take anything away from this presentation, understand that there's not one queer experience. And if you're like me and Jeremy, you also want to see a government that includes as many of these experiences as possible.
Now, before we actually get to questions, we do want to make a couple quick thank yous and acknowledgements. First off, thank you, Professor Artime, who is very supportive and flexible with this project, especially around due dates. Thank you, Professor Chavez, for both the inspiration from your book around conducting these interviews. And on a personal note, I want to thank all of my friends and chosen family for the vast amount of support you gave me, despite the fact that I probably spammed you a little too much about this project.
I share a lot of those acknowledgements with Jeremy, so thank you to my family and friends. I also want to thank Beth Craig for letting me bug her whenever I have questions about anything in the world, and it's not just limited to this presentation. And finally, I want to give our biggest thanks to the candidates and elected officials who were so gracious with their time and spent some time talking to us. Our rough draft is at about 32 pages, so believe me, we have a lot more we want to share, but we'll get to the little bit of time we might have left for questions. Thanks, everyone.
Professor Artime, you're muted.
I know. It is going that is not going to be the only time that happens. So, well, one of your we have time for one question, and we have a question from one of your interviewees here. So, Mark Elias says, Gracie mentioned that electing queer people isn't inherently progress because of multiple dimensions of intersectionality. Did the presenters compare the queer people elected to their main opponent to understand what the specific choices were and whether the queer candidates were comparatively quote unquote better or quote unquote more representative than the other options voters had?
Yeah, no, I like that question. Thank you, Senator Elias. So I think there's a couple elements to that. One element is in our analysis, specifically with this project, we're going based off of what the folks we interviewed told us. So we didn't really dive into the specifics in districts, but there were a few stories that were shared with us about the specific races and how they were engaging with their opponents. And that made its way into our analysis. I think even more than that, I want to pull out kind of that last part about being more representative. And I wonder if one candidate can be more representative than another. And I think that might be the question is maybe one candidate is more progressive than the other. I don't know if a single person can be more representative, but I do think a single person can strive to include the views of others and include the diversity of the queer community. And that's what we were getting towards. But that was a great question. Thank you. Jeremy, you got anything to add?
I think you covered it perfectly. We only analyzed opponents when it kind of came up in interviews. So when we had the opportunity to do that, we were able to analyze it, but unfortunately that was kind of beyond the scope of our method.
Well, thank you both for a great presentation and for all of your hard work on the project. It's really a great project, and the paper is excellent as well. So if they're willing to share it with you, you can always ask them to see it. But it's great work. So we will turn our attention. I'm sorry we didn't have a lot of time for questions there, but if you do have questions for any of our presenters, make sure that you share them in the chat. And if the presenters, if you're getting questions afterwards, if you want to pop into the chat and engage with our audience and try to answer some questions that maybe folks had that they didn't get a chance to ask to the group, that would be great. Our next presentation is from Sean Kim. I thought that these presentations were going to be really well paired with each other because both presentations ask questions directly to lawmakers. So Sean, do you want to tell us about your presentation?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Sean Kim. I'm a junior at POU. My presentation is on the legalization of gambling. Sorry, Doctor, how do I share the screen? Is it?
At the very bottom, there's a it should be green. It says share screen. There you go.
Got it. Cool. So yeah, my presentation is on legalization of gambling in Hawaii. A little background of why I wanted to choose this project is because I'm from Honolulu, Hawaii. Right now, all forms of gambling are illegal there. And multiple bills have been brought up throughout the past years. For example, a bunch of House and Senate bills, such as House Bill 383. It's a state poker commission to oversee live poker rooms. House Bill 772. It's a casino on the Hawaii Convention Center. It was a plan to build it. House Bill 736, which is a pilot program for digital sports betting and platforming. Senate Bill 2669, which is a lottery system and gaming center in the state. So those are just some few examples of what the ideas of the legislator proposed bills, but so far nothing has been in action or any of that. So to start off, I sent emails to the Hawaii state legislators, in total of 76 members, a total of 51 House members and 25 Senate members. The amount of responses I got back on the survey was around 28 total responses, which is amazing. So yeah, so to start off, some of the demographic we have here is age. We have a real variety of age. So no age overshadows one another. For gender demographics, we have 17 participants were male, 7 female, and 3 prefer not to answer. I find this very interesting because when I was doing some calculations, out of the 76 total legislators, 25 members of them are women and 51 of them are male. And if you turn that into percentages, that equals around 67% male and 33% female, which is really close to the numbers I get here, which is 63% male and around 25% female. A little bit more background information is like if they ever gambled before, which is 24 said yes and 4 said no. So that's a little bit background information on the participants that I've got. The next question I wanted to ask them was an open end response, and it was would legalization of gambling or lottery gaming be beneficial in the state of Hawaii? 9 participants had negatives to say about this. The rest were all positives. The general theme that I've came up with while reading over these open responses was tax revenue and other forms of income were the main 2 general themes. So here are some open answer questions that I got from the legislators, such as, yes, it could generate additional tax income, would allow for residents who want only to gamble a way to do so without leaving the state. It may generate some out-of-state visitors and would in the right program increase local residents to travel to neighbor islands. Another legislator put, the legalization and management of gambling can provide the state with critical resources to finance projects, benefiting communities that have struggled with Hawaii rising costs of living and limiting housing options. a casino may also attract more visitors to Hawaii and provide the surrounding community with opportunities for growth and development. There are plenty of great responses that I wish I could show you all, but these are just some of the, just two of them. The next question I asked was concerns and drawbacks of if it would become legal in Hawaii. And there were multiple factors mentioned, many issues that were brought up, which was great. The major themes that I wanted to cover was that organized crime, the least affordable would be gambling, gambling addiction, and social issues that could arise through these problems. So some of the open answer questions that I got was, yes, those that should not afford to gamble may be gambling away monies that should be used for living expenses for themselves and their families, possibility for higher incidence of gambling addiction and other social problems, possible increase of crimes associated with gambling, higher costs to the state and counties to address the problems associated with legalized gambling. Another legislator said, yes, the social ramifications, increased theft in the area, depression, suicide, etc. Those who gamble in Hawaii are the people who cannot be afforded doing so. There are plenty of other major factors told in these open-ended responses, but these are some of the main ones. The next question I wanted to ask was if there would be any economic benefits, if they would see any. 18 participants said yes, and 10 said no. I wanted to have an open-ended question for this as well. So 6 legislators did not see any positives throughout this, but the rest did. And the major theme was the additional revenues. So some of the open-ended questions was increased revenues to the department providing critical services such as DHHL, building affordable homes, DOE investing in schools, and etc. Increased revenue for business related in tourism and gambling. And another legislator said that money for the tax revenue and tourism. So what I took from all these open-ended responses was that, like, after reading and analyzing them, I do believe that legalizing gambling can benefit Hawaii's economy, or that's what that is my hypothesis, and I do believe that it was supported through the open-ended responses I got from these legislators. Some things I would like to do differently, if I could have it, would be to push for more legislator opinions and ask for more open-ended responses, because they're really eye-opening and very important and informative. And maybe also surveying actual residents in Hawaii, because the majority of them would be the ones gambling. So yeah, thank you for listening to my project, and any questions.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, can you please send them in the chat, and I'll make sure to pose them to our presenter. In the meantime, I'll just go ahead and kind of kick us off. Do you think that, how much do you think the effect of COVID-19 on the tourism industry in Hawaii is impacting perspectives about the potential legalization of gambling?
Well, personally, COVID-19 affected like my family, like financially, like a bunch of people got laid off through that. Like even my mom was threatened to have a pay cut, in general. So I do believe with the COVID-19 and with the not as much visitors coming to Hawaii, that really took an effect, and it showed. Even like in my household, it showed the effects of not having those same visitors and tourists come to Hawaii. So I think that the legalization of gambling and this COVID-19 pandemic has a great correlation that, yes, it will help the economy greatly. I do believe.
Other questions? What do you think in terms of, where would you put the odds right now? that gambling is legalized in the state of Hawaii? Do you think that it is more likely than not, or are you pretty pessimistic about the chances of that legislation?
Right now, I do not think any like forward progress will be made like in gambling as of right now. I did see a certain bill that took place recently, but the project management area will be done in like 2023, like in the future. But that's I don't think we're going in a positive for gambling right now.
Gracie thought I was joking about that was totally that was inadvertent. Maybe just gambling was on the mind. I was asking him to set odds. So great. Well, Sean, thank you for your hard work on this project. It's a really interesting project that you put together. And we have just a couple minutes before our next presentation. So if anyone needs to take a break, this is a good time to do that. So we'll kind of pause here. We're going to start again at 4:35. So if you need to take a break for a moment, come back in 3 minutes and we'll have the start of our next presentation. Okay, well, we'll come back together here now. Our next presenter is Sarah Van Meeteren, and it's a really interesting paper about the intersection of popular culture and politics. Something that if you've taken any of my J-term classes, you know I really enjoy talking about. So this is an incredibly interesting paper. So Sarah, whenever you're ready, go ahead and get started.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now.
Sure.
Okay, hello. My presentation is Lyrical Politics, the Influencing Power of Female Musicians on the Politics of the Undergraduate Male. For my project, I created a survey and sent it out to the students at this university. I chose to do this project because I'm very interested in how our society is influenced by popular culture. I focused my project on music, initially inspired by all the female musicians currently finding success on the Billboard charts. I thought that if more men are listening to female musicians, it would suggest that they are more aware of or more willing to learn about female issues. In this project, I asked whether female musicians can affect male political opinions. My hypothesis is college-aged men who frequently listen to female musicians are more likely to consider women's issues important when compared to males who do not listen to female musicians. However, they will still have less progressive views than women. I'm going to start with some information from my research. I first want to provide a few examples of women's issues that I ask about in my survey. These are workplace inequality, violence against women, and abortion rights. These issues affect women's health as well as their socioeconomic status. Women in the music industry have a long history of speaking out about these issues through their music as well as their activism. I believe that music can be used as a way to promote different political movements. We have seen it currently as well as historically. A good example is rap music. Black women have used the medium of rap to promote their own political and sexual agendas. A good example is Salt and Peppa's attitudes towards sexual politics in their song, Let's Talk About Sex, which Salt later rewrote as a public service announcement, Let's Talk About AIDS in 1992. I want to briefly talk about how we listen to music. In my research, I found that services like Spotify reinforce pre-existing patterns of power in the music industry by only suggesting same-gendered and same-race artists to the user. Using services like Spotify does not necessarily broaden one's musical interest and in fact strengthens preconceived notions of gender and genre. I found that men will shy away from listening to genres perceived as female like pop because they are discouraged from engaging in cross-gender behavior to a greater extent than women. This is significant because depending on the gender of the artist, listeners will be exposed to different messages and therefore differing behaviors and attitudes by different groups of listeners will be present. This is why it is important to understand that what we listen to has an effect on us. What I took from this is that men are far less exposed to women's ideas, so I assumed that when men do listen to music made by women, they might be more inclined to listen to women in their real lives as well. What people come into contact with in their everyday lives will influence their politics and lead to both lifestyle and social changes, which is why it is important to consider and monitor what messages we are getting from popular culture. I'm now going to talk about my survey findings. There were 31 questions in the survey. I got 78 responses to the survey from 44 women, 26 men, and 8 non-binary participants. 2 examples of these questions are you more likely to listen to male or female artists? And do you consider women's issues a top priority when voting? Unfortunately, my hypothesis could not be proven. All but 2 participants indicated that they listened to female musicians. The 2 individuals that said they did not were both women and both indicated their reason for disliking female musicians was that they did not like their tone of voice. My hypothesis cannot be analyzed because there is no variation, meaning there is no statistical significance. Ultimately, it seems that everyone, regardless of gender, did listen to female musicians. Because all the men indicated they both listened to and enjoy female musicians, I could not analyze the difference between men who did listen and men who did not listen. In order to fully analyze the hypothesis, more responses from men would be necessary. Regardless of the survey's inability to prove my hypothesis, I still think there is a reason to believe it could be proven with a larger sample of participants with a greater range of political views and a more exhaustive questionnaire. I believe that with more male participants, there would be greater understanding of how their music taste intersects with their political beliefs. I strongly believe that popular culture has a hold on our society and whether it be direct or indirect influences our politics. That being said, there are other questions in the survey that warrant discussion regardless of the conclusion of the hypothesis. I cannot speak on how the music affected the participants due to insufficient information, but I can speak on their political beliefs. What can be learned from the data is that while men indicated they listened to female musicians, they are still more likely to listen to male artists. And women and non-binary participants are more likely to listen to female artists. It cannot be said if this is a factor in their political ideologies. However, almost all participants, that being 91%, did agree that music can influence politics. This would suggest that while this survey was unable to prove my hypothesis, another survey might be able to. It is also important to consider the fact that the majority of participants were Democrats, who historically are more likely to be progressive on women's issues. This would suggest that another survey with more participants with differing political parties would yield different results. It also suggests that the majority of students at Pacific Lutheran University are Democrats, or at least those who are willing to take the survey were Democrats. I have two graphs that I would like to share with you. Hopefully you can see the things on them. This first graph has to do with the issue of women's working rights. I asked 3 questions on the topic and found that 97% of participants indicated that men and women should be paid the same amount. 96% of participants agreed that childcare and housework is as important and taxing a job as work outside the home. However, when asked, do you believe that men and women should be responsible for the same amount of housework and childcare, only 77% of participants indicated yes. 3% indicated no, and 19% indicated unsure. I've broken it down by gender on the graph, which you can see, but for the purposes of time and clarity, I'm going to talk about how the men in particular voted on this question. Out of 25 men, 15 said yes, women and men should have the same amount of responsibility, 1 said no, and 9 said unsure. In total, that is 36% of the men saying they were unsure. This suggests that regarding the responsibility of housework and childcare, society has not progressed beyond the point of expecting women to be in charge of the household while not holding men accountable for the same responsibilities. It would be very interesting to look into this further, especially because so many of the answers to the question were unsure, suggesting to me that the participants possibly knew that no was a less progressive answer, but they did not see a reflected society that would call for an equal share, or they themselves did not want to be responsible for that work. This is a legitimate problem considering this extra housework, often called the second shift, on top of a full-time job can be exhausting. It can lead to burnout and be a reason for less job and profit opportunities for women. Men still have an unequal advantage in the workplace because women are expected to do the majority of responsibilities of childcare and housework. This is a significant problem currently because women were far more likely to quit or lose their jobs during the pandemic, due in part because they had to take care of and educate their children. The second graph pertains to the question, do you identify as a feminist? Out of all participants, 77 indicated yes, 16 indicated no, and 5% indicated unsure. Demographically, out of 25 men, 13 said yes, they were feminist, 9 said no, and 3 said unsure. This was strange to me because most participants indicated very feminist answers to the survey questions, and yet were unwilling to call themselves feminist. It would be interesting to research this question in the future. Specifically, I would ask if they are afraid of the stereotype that comes along with the title of feminist, or if they have a greater meaning behind their unwillingness. In conclusion, I'm not discouraged by the outcome of this project. If anything, it proves that men are willing to listen to female voices, which I take as a very positive outcome. Whether or not their views have been shaped by the music they listen to and the artists they look up to is a question I would still like answered. But for now, it's enough to know that there is a reason to hope that one day more people will consider women's issues important enough to have more real positive legislation be implemented. Thank you.
Great. So we have a question in the chat for Sarah. So Zachary asked, do you have any speculations you might want to share on why few men responded to your survey relative to its total number of respondents? For example, potentially gender coding of research into gender, etc. So any thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, we do have more women than men who currently go to our school. But I sent the survey out to the political science students, and I emailed every single department head at our school, and it was up to them whether or not they were going to send it out. I don't know the specific gender demographics of each major, but I got quite a lot of the teachers in different sort of like mathematical majors to like more history majors. So I really don't know why more women took it than men. It was kind of a struggle to get the men to take it. I kept refreshing my feed all the time to make sure I would get enough responses.
Great. We have another question in the chat. Did the survey provide a definition of feminism before asking participants if they identified as one?
It didn't, and that's a very, maybe if I was doing future research, I would definitely put that in there.
Yeah, other questions? I'm curious about, so I'm curious, you come away from this feeling a little bit more optimistic, and I I think I see the results as is in some ways fairly pessimistic, that you have a democratic leaning sample, a pretty progressive group of folks responding to the questions, ostensibly, and yet you still have on some of these questions just glaring differences between men and women with respect to things like responsibility for childcare. Um, um, was that surprising to you? How do you kind of make sense of that? Where do you derive sort of optimism from some of these findings?
That's a good question. Well, initially I was very biased. I thought that there would be a lot of men that said they either didn't listen to female musicians or just didn't enjoy listening to them. And the fact that they all said they did listen, I found that to be very positive. And then with the results, I was surprised by a few times. I have a question, how important are women's issues when voting? And you rank the issues, and a lot of the time the men would put the women's issues as their first, and I'm not sure every time. I would maybe put environmental issues first, maybe not, but I was really shocked at that, how often they were saying they really cared about women's issues when voting. But there are some pessimistic things. I do agree that, yeah.
Great. We have another question here. So, what strategies would you try to increase the sample size? Could you use social media, or what other tools could you use, you think, to increase your sample size in the future?
Social media is a good option. Also, it was hard to get the professors to respond to me sometimes, and I'm thinking maybe if I had started earlier. It was a hard process to get the survey accepted, so that took a long time. So if I had more time to send it out to the professors and then remind them, perhaps they would have been able to get more responses from that. But social media also is a good suggestion.
We have time for one more if anybody has a quick question. Do you think, I'll ask one quick question here. Do you think there's something different about music than other forms of entertainment? Do you think other types of entertainment like television or movies would be as influential on someone's thinking about politics? Or do you think music is unique?
I don't know. I feel like music is more universal. I know a lot of people who don't watch TV or only watch certain types of movies. And I feel like everybody, regardless of what music you like, you hear it in the grocery store, you hear it on the radio. I think just more people, I think, are listening to music than maybe watching TV.
Great, thank you. Well, great work on this project. Really interesting findings, and yeah, look forward to reading the final project.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have another presentation lined up here. So let me pull up the order of things again, just to make sure I've got this right. Okay, great. So I thought I'd say a quick word before I have Thaddeus share his presentation with us. So we have that you basically, in our program, you could do two different types of capstone projects. So you could write a traditional research paper, and the presentations that you've heard up to this point are all based on traditional research papers. You can also propose a special project, some sort of some project that would meet the learning goals of the class while not being a traditional research paper. So for example, a couple years ago, I had a student produce a documentary. And this year we have a couple really unique projects as well. So Thaddeus has a project where he was developing a campaign strategy, and we'll hear from another a project here in just a little bit. But just to give you some context for how capstones are set up in political science, that might be helpful as we listen to Thaddeus speak. So I'll go ahead and turn things over to Thaddeus, who will present his campaign strategy. So Thaddeus, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Y'all can see my slideshow? Awesome. Hi, I'm Thaddeus. I'm a senior, and my project is Beating the Incumbent Advantage, a roadmap for leftist candidates. And so for my project, I wanted to take a phenomenon that we've seen demonstrated kind of time and time again over the past 4 years, in which an entrenched, moderate Democratic incumbent with a massive funding advantage is defeated in an election by a younger, upstart progressive challenger. Kind of these notable examples that we've seen: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman. But the problem with these examples is that those districts aren't representative of districts nationwide. In nearly all of the areas where this has happened, it's happened in dense urban areas with massive Democratic swings and strong progressive movements already in existence. And so I wanted to take a different district that didn't fit that mold and see what it would take for a leftist challenger to win there. Write a paper. Instead, it's a campaign plan modeled after those put together by actual political campaigns around the country. And so for the district that I selected, I chose one local to us, Washington's 6th congressional district, represented by Derek Kilmer. And I did this for 2 reasons. So first, it's my home district, and so that added a personal layer to the project. But second, it's a unique district that can teach us a lot of lessons about how progressives can win elsewhere. It's a decently Democratic district, but not as heavily leaning as ones where these big victories have happened. It's the oldest district in Washington with the highest percentage of voters over the age of 65. It's one of the whitest districts. It's less college educated than most districts. There's a higher percentage of trade jobs and practical education. It's one of the poorest districts. And it has a mix of rural and urban voters. Roughly half of the voters are in Pierce and this small sliver of Pierce and in Kitsap County. And the other half are in these 4 counties that kind of compose this big western chunk on the map. And so in coming up with my campaign plan, I couldn't rely on academic literature to support this for the most part, because most of that is either looking nationally or at districts with national significance. Instead, I collected the voting history of the 6th district from 2014 to 2020. I put it all in one big spreadsheet, and then I split it up into 13 different spreadsheets because it was too much to work with. And I looked at how Kilmer has been performing compared to his opponents over the past 4 elections. And what was surprising is that even as the Democratic vote share in this district has risen, Democrats have composed more of the votes, Kilmer's percentage of the vote has shrunk. And looking at it precinct by precinct, almost without fail, Democratic challengers to Representative Kilmer have gained ground. And those gains weren't massive. In many places, it was just a couple points lost per district, but they indicate the potential for a leftist challenger to succeed. And so with all that in mind, my campaign plan includes 3 components: platform, budget, and outreach strategy. Those 3 things seem to be relatively standard to be included in campaign plans. And to confirm that, I conducted an interview with Rebecca Parson, who was Kilmer's most recent challenger. And earlier, before Capstone, I had completed an internship and had very long discussions about this with Jordan Waits, who was a professional field organizer. So this was confirmed by sort of people involved in politics and involved in the industry. And so the first part of my campaign strategy was the platform, which I opted to divide into 4 general planks, areas of focus. which can be targeted at specific areas based on what part of the district is going to be the most receptive. And so to provide some explanation for this, Social Security, and protecting Social Security, not defunding it, that's something with very strong bipartisan support at a national level, where national polling has shown that it's a major voting issue for older Republicans, who are the biggest voting bloc in these 4 Western counties in the district. It's also a spot where Representative Kilmer turned out to be genuinely vulnerable. Looking over the press coverage received by Representative Kilmer, the only really notable national press coverage was last year, where an in-depth profile in The Intercept threw him into the spotlight for voting and signing letters in favor of cutting Social Security, despite promising not to do that, walking that back at home. And so that's a spot that's vulnerable and made a lot of local organizations angry. The second part of the platform was Medicare for All. Issue polling that I collected from Kitsap and Pierce County indicated very broad support in Pierce County, close to 70% support for Medicare for All. And looking at referendum voting over the past 8 or so years, Clallam County has indicated that they support substantial healthcare reform. In addition, my interview with Rebecca Parson highlighted that their own campaign's metrics showed that they had the most positive voter response when highlighting this in 2020, which shows again that it is a potential platform link. For affordable housing and implementing policies to counteract homelessness, this is a necessity for any candidate in Kitsap and Pierce County with higher rates of homelessness. And this is again supported through my interview with Rebecca Parson. She indicated that the most press attention her campaign received was for organizing events and mutual aid drives to help the homeless. And so this sort of messaging can have a positive impact on other aspects of the campaign, like press coverage and fundraising as well. Lastly, climate protection and preventing climate change. And this is something that I was surprised by, because not something that I think we would think it would be very popular in these rural areas. But what I found is that voters across the board were heavily resistant to measures that target individuals, like the tax on carryout bags. But that referendum data shows that more voters in the 6th district supported a carbon tax than anywhere in Washington except King County. They're also very receptive to other sorts of policies that target corporations. For example, voting to mandate paid sick leave by a massive margin, ending corporations' recognition as people in the Constitution by a massive margin. And so all those indicate that a sort of anti-corporate climate protection platform has the potential to succeed here. The second aspect of the campaign plan was budgeting. This is the biggest hurdle for any challenger to an incumbent to overcome. And as you can see in the graph, Kilmer in 2020 was like $2.5 million. Rebecca Parson only raised $311,000. But there's good news there, which is that Kilmer is spending over twice as much per vote than Parson. And that's partly because this is an established incumbent with much more campaign staff, but also because he recognizes the weakness that a challenger poses to him. And that's confirmed by looking at his spending in years when he did not have a Democratic challenger. In 2016 and 2018, he spent only $16,000 on advertising total in both of those election cycles. In 2020, against his first progressive challenger, he spent over $200,000 on digital advertising alone. And when combined with traditional advertising, spent almost the entire budget of Parson just on advertising. And there's been some academic literature here indicating that this can lead to an information overload effect, targeted messaging, where targeted messaging from a challenger can break through that information overload. Think of AOC's iconic poster in New York City that's been replicated across the country. All that being said, it's still the biggest hurdle. A challenger needs to raise $700,000 at least. That's assuming the same cost per vote in 2022 as there was in 2020. And then the last portion of this strategy is outreach. So In this race, local organizations rather than national organizations are the most important thing, because this is not one of these dense urban districts with a lot of pull. It's a district with very little national coverage. A challenger can't rely on a glowing profile in the New York Times or the backing of a major national organization. A progressive challenger needs to attend local democratic meetings, union meetings, conservation groups, any of these local political groups. And that's extremely important to boost visibility among everyday voters. Even if those organizations don't endorse the challenger, going to those meetings gets the face out and builds a volunteer base. The second thing that's really important here is local press. And in my interview with Rebecca Parson, she indicated that the local coverage of her campaign was essentially non-existent because she didn't have connections to local press. This is one of those benefits where a candidate runs a second time and does significantly better as a challenger because now they have those connections. The only other two things here are kind of just campaigny stuff, mailers and door knocking. In my discussions with Jordan Waits, again, a professional field organizer, he explained that for mailers, you send out mailers once right before ballots go out and a second time after ballots go out. You want the candidates to be the last thing people see before they open the ballot. And then again, as a reminder for people to vote, get it in their heads that, oh, I need to vote, maybe I'll vote for this person. And we also discussed door knocking in depth. Rural areas that don't get regular campaign visits, door knocking and events can go a long way in establishing a more personal connection to voters who may feel ignored. And so there's a lot of challenges in mounting a successful campaign against an incumbent. Obviously, closing the funding gap, having successful messaging, coordinating with local organizations. Despite those challenges, though, it's something that is possible with a very targeted and coordinated campaign strategy. And I was really encouraged in my discussions with the candidates and organizers who are putting in that work now. And I'm hopeful that we'll see this phenomenon of moderates being defeated by progressives continue to develop in 2022 and beyond. And with that, I can answer questions if people have any.
As a reminder, if you have questions, you can post those in the chat. We have time for at least one question. So if someone can add one to the chat, that would be great. Okay. We have a question. It's, do you want to be a political strategist as a career?
I definitely do not. Something that I've learned from taking so many poli-sci classes in my internship is that it takes a certain type of person to do this like professionally full-time. And I am not aggressive enough to want to do that. So no, I don't.
Well, thank you, Thaddeus, for sharing your project with us and for all of your work, your good work this semester. Our next presentation is one that is incredibly interesting, and so I think that you all will enjoy it. Brenna, if you're here, I'm going to turn things over to you to kind of share what your project is and the unique comparison that you are making in your paper.
Hi, hello. My name is Brenna Frohock. I will be doing a presentation and I will share my screen as soon as I have it pulled up. That's my bad. Okay, we're sharing the screen. This one is the one that I want. Wonderful. Okay, can everyone see okay? Okay, I have no way of knowing if you can, but I hope you can. So hi. So the title of my presentation is kind of an inside joke that me and my friends toss around and have for a while, pretty much ever since Tiger King took over the pandemic. Joe Exotic walked so that Pete Buttigieg could run. for president. So this is about how public persona and rhetoric of LGBTQ plus politicians impacts gay liberation writ large. Oh, here we are. Okay, so in abstract, in the paper, what I do is I examine the extent of the impact the rhetoric of LGBTQ plus politicians has on gay rights legislation. So I've chosen to use two very starkly different gay candidates, Joe Exotic and Pete Buttigieg, as case studies and to situate their rhetoric within queer theory and literature that exists. I used past examples of queer theory to draw parallels between how these two candidates present their identities publicly and the rhetorical acts of passing used by US officials in the past. So then I'll draw conclusions about how these two candidates and their public personae impact the struggle towards gay liberation writ large. And this is US centric, so I'll be talking about the US. In this, as a brief introduction, political rhetoric surrounding gay liberation and legislation has evolved dramatically in my lifetime, but even just in the last, 50 to 70 years. Some significant markers of political change that I note about in my paper are the election of Harvey Milk in 1977. This was in San Francisco following a very large migration and influx of gay people to urban areas like San Francisco, where they were kind of fleeing small towns and they're in their small rural areas that were less accepting of their identities. Another significant marker of change, obviously, Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015, the US Supreme Court decision to legalize same-sex marriage. And these have been accompanied by, visible increases in openly and visibly queer elected officials. But what I've seen is our main victories have been, while they're joyous, I love our victories, I find them kind of limited to things like employment discrimination and military service, at least in the ones that we promote as or hold up as revolutionary and as incredibly positive. And while these are obviously positive steps, I feel like they're mostly focused on acquiring validity for gay identities in the eyes of straight people, rather than actual material equality for gay people. So, while there may be more straight people now that, recognize that gay people can be great employees and can be great service members, there's probably less people that, agree that they should have economic liberation and that sort of thing. So there's many different interpretations as to what gay liberation looks like. I think Gracie and Jeremy did a great job of showing us that queerness is not a monolith by any means. And so everyone has a different take. To me, and the standpoint that I operate in this paper on, to me, gay liberation involves briefly, our economic freedom from a system that has disenfranchised us, sexual freedom, both the sexual freedom to our sexual liberation and sexual freedom from violation of our bodies that has been historically a problem in our community, as well as freedom from violence and discrimination in all its forms, particularly against the police. In the literature review, broadly speaking, the literature around queer politics is always going to be in flux with changes in public opinion, as well as the advancement of queer visibility. So it's become more widely recognized in academia as a result of those political advancements that we talked about, right? We're seeing more of us. People aren't just hearing about us on TV, they're actually seeing us, they're running into us at work, we're their elected officials now. And so the literature changes to reflect that. Considering the nature of homophobia, especially when someone is known to be queer, it's clear that the audience that LGBTQ plus politicians are presenting themselves to is important when they're deciding to talk about how their platforms will function, as well as their identities. So the primary text that I'll go over in this speech, not all of the resources I use, but these ones will, I think, paint a very clear picture. They're called The Pink Herring and the Fourth Persona, or J. Edgar Hoover's Sex Crime Panic from 2002, Pete and Peck on Eating Our Own by Reagan Fox, and Representation and Rights, The Impact of LGBT Legislators and Comparative Perspective by Andrew Reynolds. Just going over some of the main points in those that impacted this study and that I'll use to talk about my conclusions. In the pink herring and the fourth persona, what's really argued is that scrutiny, the public scrutiny on LGBT officials, and even ones who are not LGBT identified, they're met with such scrutiny, and that is requires secrecy of them, right? So rhetorical behavior by public political officials is dominated by that scrutiny that requires one to attempt to pass or conceal an aspect of their identity to achieve what Charles Morris calls an ethos of gender and sexual normalcy. So yeah, he describes that as a rhetorical performance, basically. And I use that to talk about the different audiences that we see with Buttigieg and Exotic. In Eating Our Own, it's argued that representation is not enough to sustain a liberation movement, even though it's exciting. And a candidate's queerness doesn't negate the intersectional privileges that they might have. I think Gracie and Jeremy also pointed that out really well. In Representation and Rights, this basically shows that existing research shows us that the presence of women and people of color in legislative bodies is able to extend rights for people in those communities. And so I use that piece to argue that the same is true of LGBT politicians, even though it's not, it's not perfect. Where is there we go. Okay, so the method I used here, I made a research question of how does the rhetorical construction of LGBTIQ plus identity from political figures inform their behaviors and the policies that they support. So that'll help us find what we're looking for, which is the impact of these political identities and then their impact on legislation. So the object for the examination of this paper is the presentation of their identity, specifically Exotic and Buttigieg. So I'll be using ideas from the literature review presented to link past rhetorical acts of passing used by different US political figures like J. Edgar Hoover to the political identity that Buttigieg and Exotic create through their campaign platforms. So I'll be doing a close reading of some campaign speeches and looking at their rhetorical strategies as well as their nonverbal cues. So to start with Buttigieg, the text in question is from a 2019 victory speech. The main themes here are religious and family identity, his military service, and the importance of gay leadership. They're really what he talks the most about. And we're comparing, this man with a clean cut haircut. He's a war veteran. He speaks, 8 languages. We're comparing his political identity, which is constructed through these themes, to this man, Joe Exotic. The text in question for him is a series of campaign videos where he was running for governor of Oklahoma. The videos show him in his fringe leather jacket, tight jeans, a bleach blonde mullet. He has like a 5-pound eyebrow piercing. And his main themes are about a much more colorful description of his identity, right? So he talks about his appearance and his vernacular. He says, I'm gay, I'm broke, and there's nothing that you can do to change that. He talks about drugs and sex a lot and the presence of shame in politics, as well as the working class struggle. And he really touts libertarianism as a solution to economic stability for everybody in the US. And there's a lot to go into there, but the conclusions that I draw by, drawing parallels between them are that the way that we talk about issues is just as important as the issues themselves. So in the struggle for gay liberation, the way that these elected officials present themselves impacts the policies that they support, as well as public opinion on gay rights. In the paper, I argue that rhetorical acts of passing have evolved as the audience to which politicians project has changed. So the goalposts of acceptable gender and sexual ethos have shifted. And so to have the rhetoric and personae of these LGBT plus politicians. And I think that we may be seeing a kind of new gay panic that Charles Morris kind of talks about as more bisexual and transgender people enter the political sphere and their platforms gain traction. We're seeing new rhetorical construction that reflects different biases. So I believe that politicians do still cling to traditional ideas of morality to increase their electability. But I argue that Buttigieg and Exotic do it in different ways because of the starkly different ways that they present their identity. So that is my presentation. I will stop sharing my screen now. So thank you everyone for watching. I would also like to extend some thanks, if that's okay, Dr. Artime, you've been incredibly helpful through this process. My family is here, so I would like to thank you all so much for, helping me get through college and get here. Thank you, Dr. Bram Frohock, for being here. My brother just graduated as well. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Woo!
That's great. well, great work on your project. Let's open things up to questions. We have a few minutes here, so if anybody has any questions, why don't you post those in the chat? There's got to be at least one question. So somebody wants to know about like the guilt or innocence of what is it?
Carol Baskin.
Carol Baskins. I couldn't remember the first name there. Yeah.
Yeah. I have nothing to say about that. So
plead the fifth.
Yeah.
We have a question. Wondering if age/gender of candidate would make a difference in what you found.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, they have different backgrounds for a lot of reasons. Pete Buttigieg, remained in his small conservative town. Joe Exotic moved to a different one in Oklahoma. But yeah, I mean, I do think that Pete being so young did play a part in his electability. But I don't think it was as closely tied to his queerness. And so it wasn't something that I looked at as much. So I don't know that would necessarily change the projection of their identity. Although now that you say it, I do notice with Joe Exotic that he does seem to project some more radical queer ideas, especially about like working class queer people, way more than Pete Buttigieg does. So maybe that is an aspect of him being older than Pete Buttigieg and having lived through maybe more virulent homophobia. I don't know. But I mean, it would definitely be something to look into.
We have a couple questions from family members here. The first one is, I think Bram is scrapping the first question, which was about who is going to win in a fight between the two of them. And the questions are now, one, does it matter that Joe Exotic is in a conservative state? And the second, what would you like to see from future candidates?
Yeah, so those are actually both pretty good questions. So Joe Exotic did come out in a pretty conservative state, but also so did Pete Buttigieg, kind of. I mean, he came out in Indiana when Mike Pence was governor of it. So he talks about that in his speech where, he was unsure if the community was going to accept him, but they did, So I think that it's not necessarily the conservative status, but it's the acceptance, right? So like I come from a very conservative state, but I was very widely accepted when I came out. Didn't have any problems really at school or at home. And I know that Pete Buttigieg had that experience. I mean, he came out, in his 30s, but his community was accepting of him. Whereas Joe Exotic, when he came out, he talks about having his father tell him to not come to his funeral. So I do think that the reaction to the coming out impacts their behavior from then on. I mean, just speaking from personal experience, it's very traumatic when coming out goes wrong. So I definitely think that might be part of it. As far as what I would like to see from future candidates, by the way, Joe Exotic would kick the absolute heck out of Pete Buttigieg in a second. Even with his cane, like he's already got a weapon. But I think from future candidates, when I think about gay liberation and I think about what freedom for all of us looks like, I think mostly about working class gay people. And so I would like to see from future candidates an emphasis on not only economic liberation for gay people, but for intersectionality in that economic liberation, right? So you can't have gay liberation if some gay people are left out of that because of an intersecting identity. There is no gay liberation if Black people are still being, murdered for being Black as well as being gay. You know what I mean? Like, what I would like to see is a more inclusive platform that centers material wins for gay people. Those are the kind of I'm more interested in like the lived experience and like your quality of life today. So I would like to see more candidates focus on that.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. So we have our next presentation is, as I mentioned before, we have you can either write a research paper, traditional research paper, or you can do a project. So our next presentation is about a really interesting project that Kieran and Corey have crafted, and I'll let them tell you about it. So I'm going to turn things over to Kieran and Corey.
Well, we are electric with energy. Can you hear us right now? Great job, ProHawk. That was an adventure project. That looks amazing. We hope that we will also be providing you with an adventure of a project. I'm going to be dropping a link in here. That is, it should be view only. If it is edit only or editable, don't go toying around with it. We have a 65 plus slide project to dump in here so that you guys can see it. Most people won't be able to dig through everything if I'm just presenting and talking to you the whole time. So we want to give it to you so that you have access to it and the ability to go digging into it. I will, of course, be sharing my screen. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Could you enable participant screen sharing for me, Professor?
Oh, sure. Yep. Hold on 1 second.
And then we're going to start with the presentation.
There you are.
Oh, there it is. All right. Okay. Got to move that down. We'll present. All right. So Corey and I have spent most of this semester working on an interactive tool that we want people to be able to get access to, as many people as physically possible. Our purpose with this tool is to allow as many people as possible to have a cursory understanding of the politics that are involved in what's going on in their state. So, of course, our working title right now is cursory. It developed as an idea surrounding the Washington state effective voting power. That is to say, if you have a number of representatives for a number of people, well, that many people have a certain value to their vote. Is their value higher or lower than the next person? How much? How little? So that's the theory, right? The end purpose was we wanted to create a website, an app, or another representative tool or educational tool that allows any person to attain a cursory understanding of their state's political geography. The envisioned version of this is either you load up a page or you download an app, and in the app, it pulls up a map of your state, or maybe it's Washington, maybe it's the United States, and you click Washington. It provides you with a series of 3 tabs. Those 3 tabs are a state one, a county one, a district one, and then there's a little button in the corner of your screen where it lets you pick plugins, right? What you should be able to do is to select down into state elections, into the elected positions of that state when you select it, right? So the state elections by population centers, okay, who got elected and when, what was on the ballot during that time. There should be a wheel of the state senatorial and congressional seats, as well as who was elected governor, who was elected here, who was elected then. For the county positions, the next tab, it's the same thing. For the district in Washington, it's again, the same thing. The county elected positions won't be the same in all states, as some states don't actually have county elected positions. We don't know that we're going to do all states, but we are hoping that we can definitely get this handled and banged out because we have the bones of it here right now for you. So the analysis. So we collected and collated a lot of information in an effort to provide folks with an invaluable resource for use in considering redistricting, voter registration laws, understanding the peculiar framework of your state. We collected an interactive map of Washington state, which is really our district map. When you go down there, you'll see a section of 2 pages. Both of those pages have links to all of the individual counties, the individual districts, and those districts then have the effective voting power in that district, right? We measure the different voting records at the state and county levels in order to better compare and complete the picture of Washington's voting. In our analysis, we determined that as compared to some states, Washington's bipartisan redistricting has provided a roughly balanced representation to voters. The effectiveness is largely borne out in how few districts are either drastically above or below the theoretical value of 1 being roughly 60,144 people per district. In fact, there were no districts that existed outside of standard deviation of this normal distribution, giving us the distinct impression that, for the most part, Washington's pretty good about that. In fact, in a moment, you'll be able to flip over and notice that the highest effective voting power per population is Yakima, which of course it is. The degree to which the supporting groups were already existing in our state and supporting apps were already existing in our state is what drove us to decide to add in a plugins option or a desire to add plugins to an option, right? So I've linked in this slide, Vote With Me, TurboVote, WeVote, and Vote.org. They are a few of the apps or tools that are there and exist in the country and in the state that want to provide help to people who want to vote to understand their state's politics. But most of them are not actually in places where people are going to recognize them and catch on to them. So this is kind of where Cursory might end up coming in. We don't know yet, right? The finalized version of this is going to include a summarization tab and an abstract for the laws, referendums, any votable items on the ballot for your state. Ideally, we also want to have a tab in there that lets you get access to Vote With Me, TurboVote, WeVote, Vote.org, whichever one of those ends up working the best for us. What Cursory is meant to do that others aren't doing, what's the niche we fill effectively, is kind of being a user-friendly, functional, existing one-stop shop for understanding your state's politics at a cursory glance. That's kind of our idea. So the table of contents, I don't want to go through the whole thing. I turned you all loose on the slides. You guys can listen to me while you go adventuring across the slides, figuring out whatever you want to find out, going and look at the various pages. Don't feel tied down by me, but of course it's sort of cover page analysis, theory, table of contents, all that stuff. We get to the state map, the county map, and the linked district map. The linked district map didn't work. We tried very many times to attach numbers to the individual counties and districts so that we could click from the district map straight down into the thing. But we have the bones for the project now. So we know it works. We have all the information. We know where to get all the information if we need more. It's just unfortunate that that map won't load for us for right now. Highlights, cool things that I found out, and I really wanted to bring to you guys. King County is the largest number of districts. 1st, 2nd, 8th, 9th, 43rd, 45th, 48th, and a couple more besides that. The 43rd has the lowest value per vote in Washington state. The 15th, that's Yakima. That's the highest value per vote per state. And one of the things I didn't know about Washington state when I began this project was that Washington state districts itself through a bipartisan body. And what it does is it redraws its districts to ensure that there are roughly 2 representatives and a senator attached to every district, and that those districts should be about 60,000. That 60,000 then goes up to the range that's 60,144, right? We dug through the information that was provided from the 2016 and 2018 censuses to get us the information for Washington state. And we checked to make sure, and sure enough, once we had already done our paperwork and figured out that the effective value was going to be roughly 60,144, we dug through the Washington State's Redistricting Commission and found that its information was the exact same and that we could have gone there first. But that's kind of how projects like this go. While we were working on this, go ahead and look through everything that's around here. Go into the Washington state in the presidential election, the gubernatorial election, the county map by population. Go down and dig through the individual districts. Go down, ask any questions, any comments. Look for anything you want to know. Is there a district that you're interested in? Is there an area that you're interested in? If there is, go ahead and look at it. Go ahead and contact us and ask us. Our purpose at the end of this is because, well, Corey and I are probably going to be continuing this following college. We really want to. All we need right now is to get in contact with somebody who has the ability and the skill and the technical skill to set up a website or set up just an app where we could make this couple slides with a bunch of information packed in behind it and a really easy, effective algorithm functional, where we can start adding plugins, where it's something that we could start handing off to people, because both Corey and I have to move on with our lives, right? But the idea is to create that effect. For our acknowledgements, we'd like to thank Dr. Artime for his flexibility and his guidance, as well as attempts multiple times to support our research during this time frame. Multiple times attempting to put us in contact with people who seemed like they would be willing to help us program this and then weren't. We'd like to thank our fellow students and fellow Washingtonians in expressing the growing and significant interest that drove us and continues to drive us in this project to fruition. Every time we had a moment, every time we had a question, every time we were kind of not sure if we wanted to keep doing this, we talked to somebody, like I would talk to my parents, and they were like, that sounds like a great idea. Why do we not have that? And so we continued. We'd like to thank each and every one of you for today, for listening and digging through these slides with us. We'd like to thank our families and our friends for supporting us, providing additional information, all kinds of things, and dealing with the project despite its many hangups. And we're hoping to complete this project before the two of us depart Washington State or the area. And we'd love to share with each and every one of you when the time comes. That being said, that's basically it for acknowledgements, comments, questions, concerns. There's a lot of information I had to dump on you, so please go ahead.
Great. Yeah, so questions. We'll open things up to questions. So you can post your questions in the chat, and I'll pose them to the presenters.
Thank you, Gracie. I appreciate it. It is a lot of information, so if you think that I'm talking too fast, I do too.
And I will say that unfortunately, none of the computer science majors within the entire school wouldn't take a dining dollar bribe. So unfortunately, that's all I had to work with. So
I think that one thing that might be helpful is if you could go back just a bit and talk a little bit more about the calculation of the effective voting power. Like,
absolutely.
How do you determine, how do you arrive at that number that they're seeing for each district?
So the way we arrived at the number was we went district to district to district. We put all of it on an Excel spreadsheet and we averaged that out. What is the average population per district? Okay, how many representatives are there for that population from the census? Our information was actually a little bit off. We were low, but that's how populations rise. And one of the things we found was that roughly 60,000 is our average, and 68,000 is incorrect. When we finally figured it out, we checked with the 2000 census, and the 2000 census represented 60,144. So do we think, therefore, that is what the districting commission is operating off of? Because the more recent one that we were trying to make work wasn't giving us that information. We were getting different information than the districting commission. Essentially, if you want a math kind of figured out in your head, you take the estimated voting population, the voting age population, you take the number of representatives for that district, you divide that number, and that's our effective value of 1. If 1, or the average, is what we want to have a 1.0 in every district, then as we go along, we should have all kinds of districts that are roughly that. But we fully expected that some districts would be low and some would be high. So as you go through, if it's a red district, it means it is below by a little bit. So there's a 0.68 or a 0.69 or 0.66 district. That's a district where your vote, because your population is higher and your number of representatives remains at 2, because Washington keeps 2 reps for districts, then you will have about 1/3 of a vote as somebody in a district that is roughly 1. Yakima, great example, has a rough effective voting power of 1.3. So you've got an extra 1/3 of a vote roughly than somebody in a nearby district. That's how our voting tally works. Next question.
Yeah, thanks for walking us through that.
It's a process, I will say. A large part of this was hoping to enter into and deal with, or create really, something that would be concrete, or that would be a physical thing that we could work on. And it ended up being a technical thing that we couldn't work on, but we made this work to the best of our ability.
Well, I am excited to see what you all come up with as you progress on this, even beyond the class. And so continue to be in touch and to share whatever it is that you arrive at. But good work going through and gathering information and calculating the data. Yeah, so let's, I think it's time for us to move on to our next presentation. So thank you, Corey and Kieran. And our next presentation, so we're now moving into what I'll call the foreign policy section of the Capstone presentation event. And so we're first going to hear from Wyatt, and then after that we'll hear from Jared. And both of them are dealing with questions of the United States and its role in the world. So I'll start out by turning things over to Wyatt whenever you're ready.
All right, let me just pull up my screen here, and there we go. All right. So, hi, I'm Wyatt, and today I'm going to be discussing my project, which I call Foreign Policy by Citizen Design. I'm going to be talking about how public opinion has the ability to affect foreign policy outcomes made by the executive branch in our United States government. Going into this, the literature, they never really came to a clear conclusion about this subject, which was pretty interesting. So it was always conflicting. It started off really that they discussed that not enough people really knew too much about foreign policy to make an educated guess or infer or set their opinions to say about the subject, and it's forever change and it's susceptible to change. However, as over time, and people's access to information grew and grew, that people were able to start making their own opinions and biases towards these foreign policy decisions. And so I wanted to hold on. Oh, there it goes. Sorry about that. So going into it, how I wanted to study it was looking at case studies. So I chose two events that did result in heavy criticisms and heavy foreign policy decisions made by different administrations. So the first case I'm going to talk about will be the Vietnam War, specifically during Richard Nixon's presidency, which was nearing the end of the war. And I'm not saying that Lyndon B. Johnson didn't get a brunt of some criticism while he was in office, but a lot of protests and stuff started gaining more traction as time went on. And so I decided to keep it down to Richard Nixon's presidency from 1968 to 1972. I did not include data from 1974 because his presidency was being clouded by the Watergate scandal at the time. And so I didn't want that to affect the data that I would have for this section. And also, as a side note, all of this data comes from the American National Election Studies. And then once I get that data collected, I analyze like either newspaper articles, historical to context, or other peer-reviewed sources that will explain like what events followed after this data was collected and showing what public attitudes were. The same process would be followed for the next event, which was the September 11th terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center. And there I will analyze like before the attacks happened, and then I'll analyze after, and then follow the same pattern that I did for the Vietnam War and analyze everything as it goes on, using the same historical context, newspaper articles, and other peer-reviewed sources to back up some claims. So going into it, we're just going to jump right into the analysis. This is going to be a lot, if I'm being honest. I have a lot of data to go through it, so this might be really brief, really quick, but I'm going to show you the highlights of what I found in each section. So going into it, Vietnam War, 1968. So going into 1968, going into President Nixon's, this is kind of before President Nixon was actually in office. This was public attitudes towards the Vietnam War at this time. So ultimately, it's kind of even across. People were starting to lean a little bit towards pulling out of Vietnam entirely, but ultimately that people decided these 2 and 3 right here, the 2 and 3 on the pie chart. So that represents like people who wanted to keep troops in Vietnam at the time, but then the number 2 section wanted to keep the soldiers in Vietnam, but they wanted to try and reach peace negotiations ultimately. And then there's also the opinion, which at this time people were starting to think, okay, maybe Vietnam was actually a mistake. We shouldn't have entered in the first place. because overall about 50% of people said we should have stayed out. And another question that was great to have was that did people consider it important in their vote? And most people, there was like, it was somewhat important. I think more people do tend to lean towards more domestic issues rather than foreign issues in usual politics. But but overall, a lot of people considered like this 1, 3, and 5 on the pie chart. That is probably these are the people who did consider it a little bit in their vote. So that would be a good majority of people do consider it. And so going into that, and so the events following, so ultimately Richard Nixon, he ultimately did want to stay in the war, but he was trying to play to the people who did want to have peace. And so he wanted to have an honorable peace. And this will either come through military action or actual peace negotiations. Unfortunately, during this time in 1970, he did announce that the United States had chosen to invade Cambodia as North Vietnamese was having some havens in there, and that sparked an outrage against the American public, which the most notable one was the Kent State protest in 1970, where 4 students were shot down by the Ohio National Guard. But overall, in the event, with the public attitudes at this time, there is peace that is wanted. Richard Nixon was trying to do that, as he did send letters to Ho Chi Minh calling for peace, but that I don't know how that did not really go very far after that. But in 1970, he did want to announce the Vietnamization, where they would start to pull out troops slowly and hand it over to the South Vietnamese people as is their war. And so as we get to 1970, more and more people are getting a little tired of the war. They know a lot of people who have lost their lives or have come back home injured through this war. So like at this time in 1970, about 50% of people wanted to stay out or wish that they would have stayed out of Vietnam. The number keeps growing. And then what we should do, this number was completely different in 1968. But now people are starting to lean towards pulling out of Vietnam entirely. And so ultimately public attitudes have changed. And I think this one goes more towards political parties, because a lot of it does rely on congressional approval to keep going forward with some of these things. So in 1972, which were midterm elections, both chambers of the national legislature switched over to the Democratic Party opposite of Richard Nixon. And then going on, the number, again, it just keeps growing. It grew up to 56%, where last time it was just a solid 50, that it is about time to get out of this war. And more people are calling for an immediate withdrawal. So 1 through 4 on the pie chart represents the amount of people who are leaning more towards getting out of Vietnam, which is a great portion of them who are studied here. And ultimately, that's what they did. The peace accords were finally signed in 1973 with Vietnam, but troops would be slowly brought out, and then that finally happened in 1975. The last few troops were finally sent home, but that came at the cost that the North Vietnamese took over Saigon and South Vietnam, and they took control of the whole country of Vietnam. But ultimately, that was the case of Vietnam. And so we go on to the September 11th terrorist attacks. This brought on a lot more foreign policy decisions after the fact that it happened, and it wasn't going on and it didn't happen as it was going on. So before going into Bush's presidency, that more people were satisfied with how foreign policy was going. He had a multilateral approach where he was cooperative with other countries. People were happy that the United States is being involved globally, which is great. But they all believe that majority of parties would handle global conflict well. They didn't have any preference. And then, but going into the Bush presidency, he definitely took a different stance, going from multilateral to unilateral, meaning that the United States would take a more independent stance, not be as cooperative. This was This was prevalent in the Kyoto Protocol, which was a climate change protocol where George Bush would end up denying it right out in his presidency. And then we go into the attacks, which led to almost 3,000 people died, where 4 planes were hijacked, 2 crashed into the World Trade Center, which would topple the towers, 1 crashed into the Pentagon. They found later that the attacks were coordinated by Al Qaeda, which was hosted in the Middle East. But another thing that this produces is that this produces an anti-Islam / anti-Muslim sentiment in America, which does affect public opinions towards some of the things towards some of the future events that will go on. And so we go into it. Overall, Bush gains a really high approval rating closely after these attacks. So he has like a 78% approval rating as of 2002, or to his response of 9/11. And then immediately after, in October, he sent troops to Afghanistan because that's where they found that Al Qaeda was working with being protected by the Taliban at the time, and people were supporting. People were overall supportive that they had entered. Another question that was brought up during these surveys was that the Iraq War was being talked about, and ultimately, but people were like supportive because they didn't want nuclear weapons to terrorists as the war on terrorism was going on. And so ultimately in 2003, Iraq War began, claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. Bush had gained congressional approval through this. It was supposed to break down Saddam Hussein's ongoing regime. And even in Afghanistan, they did take care of the Taliban, or they took the Taliban away from power, but the U.S. troops remained in the country. And so overall, but as time went on in 2004, people were starting to say the Iraq War wasn't as worth it because some of their claims, and it came out later that some of their claims to go into Iraq were unsubstantiated and not supported whatsoever. And so people were starting to be unapproving of that, but they were very approving of Afghanistan and the ongoing war on terrorism just because of the sentiment of Al Qaeda being hosted in Afghanistan. And so then around like 2007, more troops were actually put into Iraq because they were having troubles getting a new government set up. That was their whole purpose of going into Iraq, was getting a new government set up, which also led terrorist groups to come into Iraq. And so it ultimately sent to combat the war on terrorism that people do still support at this time, that it was better to send more troops. But ultimately, like what we saw with Nixon, is that the chambers in the national legislature will flip to the opposite party. And then President Bush's approval rating keeps continuing to drop throughout his whole presidency. And again, majority of citizens still approve the war in Afghanistan. And then if we go on, but then we move on to Barack Obama's presidency, people still find that combating terrorism is still a very important deal, and it's good to address, but more people are starting to disapprove of what's going on in Afghanistan at this time. So there's a little bit of a conflict in nature there, is that people consider combating international terrorism important, but approving of what's going on in Afghanistan with US troops there, they seem to be disapproving. But ultimately it was Barack Obama, he decided to actually pull out of Iraq finally after 8 years of being there. But then after that, shortly after that, he decided to increase troops in Afghanistan to counter insurgencies because the Taliban was continuing to try and take power back. But however, remote drone strikes become a more common tactic at this time, which was to attack terrorist insurgencies. But ultimately, I end the timeline here with where Osama bin Laden is actually killed by a raid by US military in Pakistan. They found him not even in Afghanistan. He was in a neighboring country. But I think that I found that significant as that he was the leader of Al Qaeda at the time the September 11th terrorist attacks occurred. And And so, but then finally in 2012, talks with Afghanistan president, the one that they were able to put in to reduce troops began to start. But ultimately, concluding, I think there's still a lot more that can go into this in terms of future research and stuff like that. I only studied on very militaristic advancements. I think there could be more analysis into stuff like foreign aid, immigration, and other forms of humanitarian aid. But overall, I feel like the public opinions and attitudes still can hold precedence over foreign policy, even though it doesn't seem like that it's talked about much among the people. But overall, when it comes to voters and it comes to the people who they're electing for, foreign policy does become a prevalent issue, and as they do talk about it in debates and stuff like that. So it's obvious that it is important to people and to making electoral decisions ultimately. And overall, that is my conclusion. Of course, there's more future research. I'd actually be interested in doing more research into this topic, into more wider range of topics. But as for right now, thank you.
Great, thank you, Wyatt. And I think we have time to get in one question, if folks have a question to ask Wyatt. I'll ask a quick question then. So in terms of like motivations for presidents or elected leaders, if public opinion matters, why do you think it matters to them? Does it matter to them because they think, you know, the public must be on to something, the public must, know, like, I trust the judgment of the people that elected me? Or is it driven by sort of electoral motivations, that I don't want to get too far out of step with what my constituents want because they're the ones who are going to ultimately either vote for or against me in the next election?
Yeah, I think that is an interesting question, and I think it's somewhat of a little bit of both. I think there is a heavy electoral thing because I think one thing I heard before in one of my previous classes is that as soon as someone gets into office, they're already working on their reelection campaign. And so really, as they're trying to make a good public appearance and trying to make sure they're listening to their constituents overall, even though not all of them will be met, sometimes they only listen to a party over everybody. And so that's a heavy case overall. So like how say like if we take for example Trump in the last presidency, he tended to listen more to the Republican Party over what the Democratic Party were saying. There wasn't any more bipartisan stuff. But overall, yeah, I think there's a heavy influence of trying to gain re-election and also have re-election for future members of the party to go in. So like when Bush was done with his 2 terms, John McCain tried to pick up John Bush's previous stuff by continuing on in Iraq and trying to get a more militaristic victory over Obama, who wanted to just reach a peace real quickly, which people were at that time were starting to prefer.
Well, thank you very much. And if you have any questions for Wyatt, you can pose them in the chat still. But thank you for your work on this project and for your presentation.
Thank you.
And our last presentation this evening, last but not least, is Jared, who has some really interesting stuff about populism and the role of populism not only in the United States but throughout Europe as it relates to the Syrian refugee crisis.
Okay, hello. I hope everyone can hear me. I just want to make sure that I can be able to move the slides around. Sometimes this stuff. Okay, perfect. So the overview for my title is The Rise of Populism in the United States and Europe and its effects on modern day Syria. So my overview, I'll be going over my research question on hypothesis, providing context, going over my literature review and methods, but I'm going to go through those pretty quickly because the bulk of my presentation is going to revolve around my analysis section. So my research question and hypothesis. So the first part is, how has the rise of populism in NATO and the United States affected Syria and its ongoing civil war, the abandonment of the Kurds, which is an ethnic group in northern Syria and throughout the Middle Eastern in general, and the refugee crisis? And then the second part, which I found later in my research that I added on, is what is the role of nations like Russia and Turkey in these foreign policy decisions? And are these independent actors connected to this new wave of populism at all? So my hypothesis answered, Donald Trump being elected in 2016 and his decision to create a migrant ban, which was enforced in 2017, and pull troops out of northern Syria have created a rise in populist far-right parties in NATO, which have instituted their own racist and Islamophobic policies. These decisions have allowed other nations like Turkey and Russia to gain territory in Syria and have created a power vacuum in the region with no clear solution to the ongoing conflicts in the region. So my literature review, I have over 27 sources, so I didn't want to list them all out here. It consists of foreign policy experts, historians on Middle Eastern affairs and foreign policy decisions, and journalists and news organizations. And it also consists of statements that have been made by world leaders at the United Nations. My methods and reasoning went around collecting statements from governments and world leaders to ensure accuracy, that these are actually the statements that are provided by world leaders and not secondary parties within their current administrations. The entire basis for my research revolved around collaboration with academic scholars and using statements from these world leaders and news organizations to support my own analysis and support for my outside sources, since I wasn't conducting my own data collection or surveys like some of my other classmates did in their projects. And my reasoning for this approach was to ensure an accurate time period for my research. The biggest problem with this project is I stuck to a 10 to 13 year time period when researching all of these different countries and the world leaders that have been directly involved, since there's a lot of turnover within political parties. New representatives and new world leaders are elected every 4 years or whenever there's an election in these countries. So I wanted to make sure that it was accurate with the entire trend of this rise of this new wave of populism throughout the world, particularly in NATO and the United States. So for context, for those of you that aren't aware of what populism actually is, it is often anti-establishment or anti-intellectual political movements or philosophies that offer unorthodox solutions or policies and appeal to the common person rather than according to traditional party or partisan ideologies. And so populist policies and political movements are often led by charismatic or dominant figures who present themselves as the voice of the people. And these people are like Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen of France, Viktor Orban of Hungary, and so on, showing that they are the only ones with the solution to the problems facing their nations. And according to these ideational approaches, populism is often combined with other ideologies such as nationalism, liberalism, and socialism. So there is populism on either side of the political spectrum. But from what my research showed on this particular foreign policy event with pulling troops out of Syria and the immigration policies that have been enacted throughout NATO and the United States, these decisions resonated more with far-right populist-based political parties and movements. So my analysis, a breakdown of the three separate groups that I found within my research. The first group consisted of outside actors not directly tied to far-right influences or made decisions unconnected or in direct conflict to NATO or United States interests. The second group, which was NATO nations that have seen a rise in populism over the last 4 to 5 years, but over the greater trend of 10 to 12 years overall, and have begun enacting their own concrete policies in response to the ongoing Syrian civil war, the refugee crisis, and the fight against ISIS, which has entered a new phase. The United States is the third group as the focal point due to the two key decisions that were orchestrated by President Trump's administration, and these decisions directly connect the other groups, but for different reasons overall. So to start out with Turkey and Russia, I broke this down into 6 key groups based on my research. So far-right party influence, domestic and international policy, anti-immigrant sentiment and policy, far-right influences in House and the government, long-term effects, and their current leaders. So for Turkey, the far-right party influences are not directly linked, but there is still far-right far-right parties involved in Turkey. However, these decisions are based on Turkish autonomy and ensuring that Turkey has a more stable presence in the region overall. So domestic and international policy, they are not directly correlated to the United States as an ally, but they are often seen as direct opposition to US interests in very close proximity with their military operations in northern Syria and how they went about their military operations in the region. Their anti-immigration and sentiment policies are in direct opposition to Kurdish autonomy, which is an ethnic group that is located primarily in southern Turkey and northern Syria. And there have been extremist groups that have been supporting this new wave of Kurdish autonomy, but they have also been an instrumental role in the fight against ISIS. But Turkey has been vehemently opposed to any sort of Kurdish autonomy. So they have been launching military incursions, launching airstrikes, and various other military interventions to prevent autonomy from occurring. The far-right influences in houses of government they are directly connected to Turkish interests, but have no real connection to the greater trends from my research that I found in NATO or in the United States. The long-term effects for Turkey, ongoing military intervention and instability in the region is prevalent, and the current leader is Recep Erdogan, the current prime minister of Turkey. And then for Russia, not directly linked, they have been in opposition to NATO and other nations involved since they are trying to create a buffer with NATO and the United States in general. They have anti-Islamic sentiment through their occupation of primarily Muslim regions in Russia and their previous engagements in Afghanistan and Chechnya in the 80s. Their far-right influences in House of Government, opposition parties in Russia have no real power, as pointed to the examples of their recent opposition leader of Russia being sent back to Russia and then recently imprisoned for basically life. So the long-term effects, they are continuing support of al-Assad, the current dictator of Syria, and then they are also trying to create a buffer with NATO. And the current leader is Vladimir Putin, who has no real opposition to his role. NATO in Europe, there's multiple slides for this, but I'll try and get through this information as easily as possible. For France, it is led by Marine Le Pen. For Hungary, it's led by President Viktor Orban. And for Italy, it is created and led by a coalition of parties. For policies for France, they were recently instituting a hijab ban for anyone over the age of 16. And they have created a coalition of support in Syria within their government and within their party system with the National Front that is led by Marine Le Pen. For their, let's see here, I can't really see the slide. Okay, perfect. The immigrants have been under attack by far-right groups in response to attacks in Europe. So there have been numerous terrorist attacks in France, and in direct response to that, mosques have been vandalized and burned, imams have been attacked, and sometimes even near death in some of these attacks. And overall, the anti-immigrant sentiment in France is very, very high, so much so that they have had to oftentimes place security in front of mosques to ensure their safety for their worshippers. Far-right parties in House of Government, that would be the National Front, and Marine Le Pen was a front runner for the French presidential election who was ultimately defeated by the current leader, Emmanuel Macron. And for Hungary, they created an actual physical border manned by armed military guards in an attempt to try and create an image of strength for the Hungarian people. Immigrants face religious and racial persecution for safety for Hungarian citizens. So any sort of Islamic presence in Hungary is severely resisted. They do not want any sort of presence of mosques or hijab or any sort of direct ties to the Islamic faith in their country. The current parties that are holding the most weight are the Fidesz and Jobbik parties. And the long-term effects for this populism wave in Hungary, the current Orban administration has been under investigation for multiple corruption charges and is considered to be one of the most corrupt governments in NATO. And for Italy, it is led by a coalition of parties. Their intervention in the Mediterranean Sea is the most important in this entire wave of populism, as they have been seen as the leader in their attempts to prevent immigrants from entering into Europe by way of the Mediterranean Sea. The anti-immigrant policies are based on racial and religious persecution, ensuring that Italians don't see their borders, quote unquote, overwhelmed by immigrants that would see their way of life uprooted. And these efforts are led by the Lega Nord and Libertà parties. And for the long-term effects, they have been gradually increasing their presence in the Mediterranean with more military vessels. And there is growing anti-Islamic sentiment for their country to be able to do more in the region in preventing this new wave of Islamic extremism from entering into their country. And their current leader is Mario Draghi. And then these last three countries, they're kind of secondary actors. So I'll breeze through this information overall. The main actors, France, Hungary, and Italy, have been the most vocal in their attempts, since Italy was seen as the leader for preventing immigration in the Mediterranean. France was seen as the leader with the most popular overall presence with populism, with Marine Le Pen leading the charge, and then Viktor Orban, who actually has his own current administration leading the Hungarian people. So for the Netherlands, they have growing Islamic sentiment and rhetoric, but it hasn't really led to a lot of concrete actions. The most extreme one is the immigrant relocation program. So they are now starting to expel Syrian refugees in their country and sending them back to Syria, which is extremely dangerous because Syria is basically in a power vacuum right now with no real control over their government. And this is led by the Party for Freedom and the Dutch Labour Party. And the long-term effects are complete reversal of initial policies that they laid out. So it's just seeing how this new wave of populism is starting to affect countries that haven't really had this effect over the past 5 years. So the country like the Netherlands was a really interesting country to look at due to the fact that this movement is very new for their country. And for Germany, they are also not exactly a leader or front runner in this new movement, but they have seen a revitalized far-right movement led by the AfD and NDPG party. And this has created an increase in attacks and hate speech against immigrants, where immigrants have been beaten and they don't want Islam coming into their country and infecting their Christian way of life based on statements that the AfD have made. And Poland is considered the most far right out of all of these countries, but they have been consistently among this group. However, this was a more recent country that I researched. It is led by the PIS and SP parties. They are completely anti-Islamic and anti-immigration laws. They don't want any sort of involvement with taking in refugees from Syria, having any sort of increase of Islam, since they are predominantly Catholic, Orthodox Catholic. So they have no real interest in taking immigrants in and allowing any sort of change in their conservative behavior. They have gone so far as to vandalize mosques that have been opened up in secret and have been attacking migrants that have been going through Poland to other more friendly countries in NATO. So this has been a very interesting process to study with Poland. And to conclude with the United States, far-right party influences include Donald Trump, Stephen Miller, Stephen Bannon, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Paul Gosar. And Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar are more recent in this new wave of populism in the United States, since they tried to create the America First caucus, but was immediately shut down by more moderate voices in the Republican Party. And it is also led by Jim Jordan and Matt Gaetz. And Matt Gaetz has been recently involved in a very serious sex scandal. So it is very interesting to see the correlation with these new members of Congress and how they are oftentimes connected to criminal prosecution. For domestic international policy, there was an increase in drone strikes under the Donald Trump presidency, and troops on the ground were also pulled out in this so-called new approach to foreign policy. There is an increased use of surveillance on American citizens, and this has been only just been revealed to the American people over the past 6 months in response to this new wave of populism. Anti-immigrant policies revolved around the migrant ban in 2017, which restricted bans from primarily Muslim countries, and using from Trump's use of slurs to describe people in Africa, Islamophobic speech, and this issue of use of intimidation with groups like the Proud Boys. So they have been leading the charge through connecting this far-right movement with actual support from groups like the Proud Boys or other far-right groups like the Ku Klux Klan. So the far-right parties and houses of government, so the New Republican Party, which is led by Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar and other recently elected representatives and senators. This is attempted creation of the American First Caucus, Republican support for voting restrictions and targeting specific areas and states where there are predominantly minority voters. So this is the most extreme in terms of the greater populist wave that I've seen throughout NATO and then through the United States, with the new voting laws and voter registration laws that have been passed in states like Georgia, and with the American First Caucus that was attempted to be created, and then long-term effects, the permanent damage to our democracy, the systematic destruction of Syria, and the possible creation of a new ISIS. There have been a lot of different concerns within the foreign policy community and the Pentagon with militias that have been created by ethnic Kurds that were in our support to fight ISIS. They are now seeing a swing to where these groups are now becoming more extreme and are embracing former ISIS fighters into their ranks. So, conclusion, what I learned, this is an ongoing issue. A lot of my research at this point is still dealing with how all of these different groups connect and seeing what can be done about it in terms of understanding why this came to be and why this issue is important. This foreign policy connection to NATO and the United States and then outside actors like Turkey and Russia has created a very tumultuous environment in the Middle East region, primarily in Syria. So this issue is still ongoing. So I still plan to continue this research, and I hope to possibly make this more broad. Just because of the time restraints with this semester, I wanted to make sure that I got enough information to make it a presentable project, but I want to make sure that this issue is reported not only for the people that have lost their lives in this conflict, but also for reasons of protecting democracies around the world, because populism is directly authoritarian and anti-democratic. So this new wave of far-right parties is very concerning. And the global long-term effects I also addressed. Special thanks, my friends, for getting me through this project. It's been a process. My family, especially my parents, and then my advisor, Dr. Aratime, who was very helpful over these last few weeks to being able to finish my project in a timely manner. And then questions. If anybody has any, I will stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Jared. Good work. Anyone have any questions that they want to add to the chat?
I appreciate everyone sticking around for this long. I know that it's also late in the evening.
I'll pose a quick question for you, Jared. How do you think what do you think the role is of the United States? Do you have any sense? Because really your analysis stops at the end of the Trump administration. Do you have a sense for what things are going to look like under the Biden administration? Have you seen things from the administration so far that leads you to think that the influence of the US is going to look differently over these next 4 years?
So as of right now, we're close to the midterm elections, so we will see what his year and a half of leading the country leads to in terms of the House and the Senate for elections. I would say with his recent stances of saying America's back and being more involved as a world power, I think that his administration and the Democratic Party will try and make it seem like we are still trying to reconnect with the world based on the more isolationist stance that Donald Trump took with his leadership style. But I see that with this new movement with these representatives that have been elected, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar and Matt Gaetz and all of these other representatives, this new Republican Party isn't going away anytime soon. And I would see that this new evolution of the Republican Party either is going to fracture the two-party system or completely change the Republican Party as we see it. So.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions for Jared? well, if not, great work. And I just want to, say again that you all did such tremendous work this semester. I have read most of the rough drafts now, and while there's still a little bit more to do, I am really optimistic with what these final projects are going to look like. And so you are all to be commended for putting together really excellent projects in the midst of really challenging times. And so I really appreciate your work doing that. Also, just again, one of the things that I told you at the very beginning of the semester is that this is a celebration of your time in the department. Like, this is the last thing you're doing as political science majors. And so it's not just about this individual project, but you all have done tremendous work as political science majors. And Dr. Chavez, she had to take care of a family issue, but I know that she echoes this with me, that we are incredibly proud of what you have done during your time in the department. And we look forward to seeing what you're going to do when you leave here. So if you're still here with us watching the presentations, any audience members are welcome to unmute yourselves now, and we'll give a round of applause to all of our presenters this evening.
Somebody snap.
Great. Well, with that, that's all we have for this evening. What a great night of presentations. Go celebrate with friends or family, or however you choose to celebrate. But do take a moment to reflect on your excellent accomplishments. So I will touch base with all of you about next steps. You should have gotten feedback from me about your projects, but don't worry about that tonight. Look at those things tomorrow, and take a moment to celebrate tonight. And I will talk to you all again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ardan.
Thanks, everybody. Great job.
Thank you, guys.